And also following your previous answers, Taiwan, of course, Taiwan has become a hot topic for many reasons.
Sure.
And one of them is semiconductor.
Yes.
So you organized a symposium last September at Harvard Kennedy School discussing Taiwan's semiconductor industry and its implication for geopolitics. And in your view, what should Taiwan and the U.S. do together to build a better and more resilient global supply chain for semiconductors?
Well, thanks. Yes, thank you, Charles. Good question. We enjoyed that very much. I mean, we had invited this is September last year in 2023, we had invited some of the founding fathers of ITRI and Taiwan semiconductor industry to Harvard Kennedy School. Importantly, as well as leaders from Japan who focus on semiconductor policy, industrial policy, South Korea, and of course the United States. We had Ronnie Chatterjee, who was the White House coordinator for the CHIPS Act and has now returned to the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. So we had really a wonderful set of discussions around challenges and solutions. I think one obvious macro concern during that conference was potential change in U.S. administration. So, I mean, everyone's talking about that. I think we will continue to talk about it in the region. It will rise even more, of course, as we approach the election in November. And a lot of concern about shifting from President Biden to a return of Donald Trump. So I think the first point I'd make is one important point we discussed was the need, and we talked a bit about how we would start this, to identify key indicators of U.S. commitment to increased coordination in the region, but also globally in the semiconductors industry, and particularly related to the CHIPS Act. That way, allies and coordinating economies can monitor, in a way, the ways in which U.S. political will could change. There was a separate part of that, which is, fortunately, the CHIPS Act is a piece of legislation, right, passed by Congress itself. So there's a reason, even though that's very difficult to do, the reason that the Biden administration importantly did it that way and not through an executive order, right, by one president that can easily be reversed by the next, was because it's legislation. So Congress would have to vote on that again to pass new legislation, which is very difficult to do. It's a very high bar. So I think that's one point that was raised. I think the other major area that we focused on was labor. As you know, it's another major topic that a lot of people in Taiwan, in the U.S. and many places talk about. I think there were 3 points that were most interesting, I think, to me. One is a lot of that labor scarcity is not localized exclusively to engineers, right? So companies are battling major shortfalls in lots of other things across the globe, right? So skilled construction, facility logistics coordinators. So because those shortages cut across a range of professions and specializations, one of the important aspects we discussed was that policy in Taiwan, the US and Korea and Japan, Europe, also really needs to focus on those non-engineering education pipelines. So that was one. That was, I think, an important point. The other two were just, and this is for me incredibly interesting, is like in places like Italy, like my mother's country, a lot of the knowledge in Taiwan is, let's say even a place like TSMC that is a global leader, you know, when you really dig into it, a lot of that knowledge is what we call like tacit knowledge or silent knowledge, meaning it's a company like TSMC iterates so frequently in such a small area with so many of their suppliers, right, who are often family owned, quite small actually, that, you know, much of that knowledge is by doing, not necessarily, it's not necessarily well documented and easy to replicate, because it's learning by doing, lots of back and forth, quite scrappy, a lot of adjustments that are just in time. So we talked a bit, the second point was we talked a bit about while it's difficult for firm, a company like TSMC, they don't want to make it more explicit, that knowledge, right? And they don't want to standardize it to an extent. If you don't, it is very difficult to make that work in other countries. There are positive examples, seemingly. So it seems to be more progress in places, let's say for TSMC, like in Kyushu, Japan, as opposed to places like Arizona. But that sort of tacit knowledge is one big challenge in how policy addresses that. I think the last point I'd make is that solving policy, we tend to focus, I think, as analysts, as academics, on the national level, right, of policies. But as you well know, a lot of this is happening at the local level with state and local economic development organizations, right? So we talk a lot about in the U.S. federal financial support, but a lot of the actual companies, Taiwanese companies that are trying to coordinate with the U.S. and invest, are really talking about how critical those the quality of the local economic development organization, the local state government, and more importantly, how dynamic and how deep is that startup community, right? So that exact same thing where you see in Hsinchu, where there's these scrappy, often private, family-owned, smaller companies. If you don't have those in places in the U.S. or other countries, it's really hard, right, for it to take root. And that's not an easy answer because a lot of places want to be Silicon Valley, a lot of places want to be Hsinchu, right? And there's not so many. So that, I think that was the other issue we talked about related to labor. So those are some of the many topics we covered.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I totally agree with you. The skillful, workforce and the ecosystem and the government policy and also the company's strategies are all very important to the success of in the semiconductor industry. But from
exactly,
Taiwan's, but also from Taiwan's point of view, we are very happy to see that our company has a closer cooperation with other countries. Like in the US, in Japan, and Germany.
That's
so
right. That's right.
That means we are already on the right track of, building a more resilient supply chain with like-minded countries.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's right. I mean, the only thing I'd add, Charles, is I agree with you. I think there's also some real obvious, and I think many people know this in the industry, of course, and are pushing. There are real questions that for a lot of the top 10, top 15 trading countries, sort of different trade sort of centers of trade with the United States. This question of double taxation avoidance is another big one, right? So Taiwanese companies are really pushing hard for that, some type of agreement that's a double taxation avoidance agreement with the U.S. that hasn't happened, right? So that's another example where policy, where existing policy deters more resilient supply chains. That's just one example as well that we talked about.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.